Thank you all for coming. My name is Fatma Mili. I'm the Dean of the College of Computing and Bioinformatics here at UNC Charlotte. It is my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce to you this morning my colleague, my friend, and role model, Dr. Barbara Oakley. I could talk about Barbara Oakley for a day, but I kept it to a page, so don't worry. So she is a professor of systems engineering at Oakland University. Among her many accomplishments, she is an IEEE fellow, a fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineers. And this past year, she was awarded the Michigan Professor of the Year Award. Dr. Oakley is very hard to put in any neat box. She is the intellectual explorer and adventurer that we all dream of being. She started as a linguist, turned into an engineer, turned into a neuro and social scientist. And because she loves to share, she is really an educator at heart. She maintained the sense of awe, the sense of curiosity, and self-confidence to take on any new topic and bring in a fresh perspective from which we all learn. She's the author of 9 books with a diversity of topics that span everything from Russian translating to learning. Her latest 2 books are on sale outside, and the book A Mind for Numbers sold 500,000 copies and was the New York Times Science bestseller. And actually, this book is what inspired her to create a MOOC on learning that she taped in her basement. And this MOOC became one of the most, actually it's competing with another one as the most popular course on Coursera, competing with 10,000 other courses. On the personal side, Dr. Oakley is married to Philip that she met in the South Pole, but that's another story. She has 2 daughters, and her family has adopted 2 sons during the Kosovo War from Kosovo, and that says a lot also about Dr. Oakley. So I told you I could talk about her all day, but I'm not going to take from her time. So please help me welcome Dr. Oakley.
Thank you, Dr. Mealy. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's so I have to tell you a little secret about myself. I just love to watch people. I love it. So I have to tell you about one of the most interesting persons I've ever watched. Now, this was when I was working down in Antarctica at McMurdo Station. And Neil was just a little guy. He was thin, wispy voice, big head, so he looked like this sort of upside-down exclamation point. And Neil's talent was that he could mimic almost anybody. And so the station manager, who Neil worked as the assistant for at McMurdo Station, was a big man named Art Brown. Art was about 6'8", deep baritone voice. And what Neil used to like to do was he used to like to pick up the phone whenever it rang, and he'd say, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking," in a perfect imitation of Art Brown's voice. So one day the phone rings and Neil picks it up. "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking." And it was Art Brown on the other end of the line. And Art says, "Who the heck is this?" or words to that effect. And Neil says, "Why, Art, this is you." I'm so glad you've finally gotten in touch with yourself. And so that's what we're going to be doing here this morning, is helping you to get in touch with one of the deepest and most important aspects of you as a human being, and that is your ability to learn. Now, I should back up for just a minute and give you a little insight into my own background. I grew up moving all over the place. So by the time I hit about 15 years old, I'd lived in 10 different places. Now, it's not a bad thing to move around, but there's one subject that is extremely sequential, and that is mathematics. And if you fall off anywhere along the way, it's hard to get back on. So when I was about 7 years old, I was moving from Lubbock, Texas to Chelmsford, Massachusetts, and suddenly they were way far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. And you would think, oh, well, she's smart, she figured it out. No, I didn't like math to start with. So I said, I can't do it. I just don't have the math gene. And I proceeded to flunk my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is really kind of ironic since I am standing here in front of you as a professor of engineering. And I am the real deal. I publish in good journals. But one day, though, one of my students found out about my sordid past as a math flunky. And he asked me, he said, how'd you do it? How'd you change your brain? And I thought, how did I do it? I mean, I was this little kid and I love this picture because it is the last cute picture of me. But I was this little kid. I loved animals and I loved knitting and weaving and things like that. And I thought, what can I do when I grow up? Because I clearly can't do anything technical at all. And I thought, I would like to learn another language. And back in the day, quite a while ago, it wasn't as easy as it is today to learn other languages. And in fact, you couldn't get college loans very easily, and I couldn't afford to go to college. And so I found out there was one way I could learn a new language and actually get paid for it. And that was to join the Army. So that's me looking really kind of nervous as I'm about to throw a grenade. And if you knew how clumsy I actually am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn a new language. I learned Russian. And I ended up working out on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and I just loved seeing the world through new perspectives and having new adventures. And so I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that's where I met my husband. So, so I always say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. But the thing was, by the time, so I was approaching my later 20s, and I was getting out of the Army, and for some reason, recruiters were not banging on my door and saying, we have got to have your Slavic languages and literature background. And I thought about things, and I'd taken such pride in being open to new perspectives and learning new things. And yet at the same time, here I had blocked off learning anything in math and science. And I thought, now, wait a minute. Aren't I supposed to be open to these things? What if I actually try to see if I can change my brain and learn in math and science, even though I may not have the math gene? And so at age 26, I left the Army and I went back to the university and I started with remedial high school algebra, and I slowly began studying. And if you look at my old textbooks from back then, they have these little dimples in the pages. Why do they have dimples in the pages? It's because I would look and I'd read and I'd work really hard. And I'd try to understand it. And it was almost like it was written to deliberately obstruct my understanding. And I'd finally get so frustrated, I'd take a fork and I'd stab the page. But how many of our students are actually in a similar situation? So if I had known then, what I know about learning now, it could have made things so much easier on myself. Now, back when that student, asked, how'd you change your brain? Well, I should say that when he asked that question, I thought, now wait a minute, maybe I should see if I can write a book and answer the question, how'd you change your brain? And so, because I like to write books. And as I was, so I wrote a book and I put it together. And then, has anybody ever heard of this outfit called RateMyProfessors.com? There is a way that you can go to RateMyProfessors.com and you can actually download the top 200 to 300 professors in lots of different disciplines like engineering, psychology, English. So I downloaded the names of thousands of top professors in about a dozen different disciplines. And I asked them, how do you teach so that people can learn, and how can I know how to help people learn more effectively? I've written a book about this, a manuscript. Maybe you'd like to read this and give me some feedback. So I sent emails out to all of these professors. Shocking percentages of them got back to me and said, sure, I'll take a look at the manuscript that you have. And so I got all this great feedback. But one of the things that surprised me was that a lot of these individuals, they had this sort of like almost a shared secret handshake. They used this one way of teaching that helped them rise above all the other professors. And what was that way of teaching? It was using metaphor and analogy. And they didn't want me to mention this to other professors because the other professors would make fun of them for using this. And why would other professors make fun of them? It's because they'd say, that's the reason you're such a good teacher. It's just because you dumb down the material by using metaphor and analogy. And of course, you make it easy like that. You're not teaching the real deep substance. But we now know through neural reuse theory that if you give an idea using a metaphor, so let's say that you're trying to teach about how electrical current flows. Well, babies will spend years learning how water flows. I mean, they'll play with it. Actually, the way that water flows is quite complex, and learning how that happens is a really complex thing. And so if you understand water flow, a good professor can use that as an analogy for how electrical current flows, and you can be onboarded onto that new idea much more quickly. Now, is it positive ions flowing this way or electrical negative electrons flowing this way? Or when you get down to a quantum level, does the metaphor all break down? Absolutely. But the thing is, when you have a metaphor, a good metaphor, and you get to a level where it breaks down, you just throw it away and you get a new metaphor. And that's how you can teach things and onboard students much more efficiently. So when I was putting together that manuscript, I reached out to top neuroscientists, top psychologists. I myself have taught for many years in engineering and also done research in engineering education. So what I'm going to present to you this morning is some of the best of what I've found about how we learn effectively, growing from the fantastic research of great researchers from all these different disciplines. Now, the brain, as we know, is enormously complicated. But fortunately, we can simplify its operation to two fundamentally different modes. And the first is what I'll call focused mode. And focus mode is just what it sounds like. You're focusing, hopefully you're focusing here. And the second mode is what I'll call diffuse mode. So the first mode, focus mode, is often called task positive networks by psychologists. Diffuse mode is task negative networks or default mode network. And this diffuse mode is you're thinking thoughts, but they're internally generated. You're not focusing on something external. They're arising from inside, and they might be the kinds of thoughts, for example, when you're standing in a shower or going for a walk or riding on a bus. So they're much more just random kinds of thoughts, seemingly random at least. Now, to better understand these two different modes, we're going to use, what? Yes, a metaphor, analogy. And the metaphor we're going to use is that of a pinball machine. So if you're of a certain age, you will remember how a pinball machine works. And if you don't, well, all you do is pull back on a plunger and a ball goes boinking around on those rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that pinball machine and we're going to put it right onto the human brain. So are you ready for it? Okay, here we go. There's the pinball machine on the brain. So this is a metaphor or analogy for the focused mode of thinking. And if you look, see how close together those rubber bumpers are. So what's happening in the focused mode is you generally have patterns you've already laid related to a specific kind of subject area. For example, if you know multiplication, you've got these kinds of patterns. And so if I asked you to multiply 42 times 77, some of you could do it in your head, others would draw out a piece of paper, but the thoughts would just move. Sorry. So I think it'll tone down here very quickly. So the thoughts will move right along the patterns you've already laid. But what happens when you're trying to learn something completely new? So, for example, let's say that you know multiplication really well, but you're trying to learn division. And so you sit down and you start to work a division problem. But the thing is, you don't have division kind of laid into your brain yet. You haven't done those kinds of problems before. So you haven't placed the patterns in your brain. You don't know how to get them into your brain. You don't know where they are, how to access them, How do you learn something new? Well, it turns out that when you're starting to learn something new, what will often happen is you'll start, let's say someone introduces you to division, you're trying to lay these new patterns down, but you inadvertently, you can't help it, but you fall back into the patterns you're already familiar with, and it doesn't work. And you start to get more and more frustrated. In fact, you take the fork out and you stand the page of the book, but it can get very frustrating. In fact, so frustrating that eventually you shut the book and you walk away and you start doing something different. Well, when your mind gets off, and I mean completely off of that subject that you were working on, what that does is it opens up another mode of thinking, another set of pathways. And this is the diffuse mode. So in this different mode, notice that those little rubber bumpers are a lot more widely spaced. So, okay, careful, depending on the sound. So here we go. Is it going to be too loud? Oh, they made the sound quieter. So great. So what happens is you're thinking much more broadly in this mode. So you can't think in that very careful, focused way that you can think of when you're in the focused mode, but you can at least get to a new place, a new perspective where you can begin to look at and solve these new problems. Now, learning, as it turns out, you often go back and forth between these two modes. And you can't be in this one mode, you can't be in two modes at the same time unless you're taking certain forms of mushrooms, and I'm not advocating that here. But so this is kind of the essence of the learning process. And what can often happen with students, for example, with me as a youngster, I thought, well, I can't just sit there and figure things out right away like some students can, and so I must be stupid about this. But because I didn't know that it's perfectly normal for some kids to start it, have to back off a little bit, and then come back, and that's actually quite a normal thing, and you can learn just as effectively as the super fast learner if you're doing that. If I'd just known this, it could have kind of inoculated me to those feelings of frustration I'd felt when I was a young person. So what I'd like you to do now is I would like you to hopefully you can pair up with someone who you've never met before. And I would like you to just introduce yourselves and then explain what is the difference between focused and diffuse modes. You have 2 minutes on your mark. Get set, go. Okay, if you can hear me, raise your hands. If you can really hear me, raise both hands. See, it works like a charm. Notice what happened when we did this. You were focusing on what I was saying, but when you turned to someone else, you were momentarily in the diffuse mode. So it gave you a different perspective on what I've been thinking or speaking about. So as professors or as instructors, if you can have a little bit of that back and forth between direct instruction, which is a very effective way of conveying information, with some of these active breaks where you can have the diffuse mode interlude momentarily and speak it with people and have a different perspective, that can be very, very useful and helpful in your teaching. So just to give you a bit of a different perspective, you can almost, and again, this is all metaphorically speaking, but it's a helpful metaphor, I think. You can almost think of your brain as having 2 pinball tables within it, and you work really hard or kind of hard. I mean, you have to turn your attention to focus on something. You have to deliberately do that. And then your attention will stay there for a while, and then whether you like it or not, sooner or later, that attention will fall, and then you'll wander into a little bit of mind wandering. But with some people who have more attentional challenges, it's almost as if they have extra holes in their pinball table. So they are focusing, they bring their focus back, but it's a little easier for their attention to wander. And what you're going to find is that this can actually give some learning advantages. So Another thing that I think is quite interesting relates to meditation. Sometimes people will ask me, well, how does focus mode, and diffuse mode, do they relate to meditation? And they do. It turns out there are two major forms of meditation. One involves sort of a focus type of form, like mantra meditation. You're focusing on a specific kind of object or subject. And the other type is called open monitoring. And this is more like mindfulness type of meditation. And it does seem, the mantra type or focused mode type, that really does enhance your focus mode. And then the more open monitoring enhances diffuse type of meditation. Now there's intriguing findings from research, because it does seem that diffuse mode is affiliated with creativity. You're making these random broad connections. And so if you focus all the time, you're always focusing, it may actually suppress operation of the diffuse mode. So it may make it a little harder to be more creative. On the other hand, let's say that you're a somewhat anxious individual. Well, anxiety is promoted when you're in the diffuse mode. And so, because it's these random internally generated thoughts like, did I leave the stove on? What did I say? What did they mean by this? And that kind of thing. And so sometimes focus mode can help suppress these kinds of anxious thoughts, and that in turn can help you be more creative. So it's a very interesting sort of dance of things, and I just find that fascinating. So there is one thing, though, that we do as human beings that I think has more impact on our ability to learn than virtually anything else we do as students, as professors. And I hear from students all around the world in teaching the course, Learning How to Learn, that this is their biggest challenge. And yet, surprisingly, often educators will address all sorts of other things to help students learn except this one thing. What is this one thing? It gets to that. It's actually procrastination. And so I'm so surprised, because you go to the major research labs in psychology around the country, and they'll talk about things like deliberate practice and interleaving and all these, and they won't even think about the fact that if you don't get students to the table to begin with, it's going to be pretty hard for them to learn. So it's worth us spending just a minute or two to speak about procrastination. As it turns out, when you even just think about something you don't like or don't want to do, it activates the pain centers of your brain. So the brain, naturally enough, skitters away to somewhere else. And it goes something like this. Now, we know procrastination is just a habit, like any habit. It can be good or bad. But what happens with procrastination is you just kind of think about something you don't like or don't want to do, and it activates a little bit of those pain. You feel uncomfortable. So you turn your attention to something else, and the result is you feel happier almost immediately. Now, you do this once, you do it twice, not a big deal. You do it very often, though, and it is procrastination. It can have serious long-term consequences on your life. And so, since I'm an engineer now, I just cut to the chase. What do we do about procrastination? Well, the biggest thing is something called the Pomodoro Technique. How many here have heard of the Pomodoro Technique? So, a few of you. Okay, for the rest of you, this is like the world's best technique. So take notes, you will love this. And I hear so often from students in Learning How to Learn, they find this so valuable. So the big thing about the Pomodoro Technique is it's super easy to do. So all you have to do is, first of all, well, this technique was invented by an Italian, Francesco Cedillo, and it was in the 1980s. And he had this beautiful little tomato-shaped timer, and Pomodoro is Italian for tomato. But what you do is you just, first off, you turn off all distractions. So no little ringy-dingies on your cell phone, nothing on your laptop, nothing like that. And then you set a timer, any timer, for 25 minutes. And then you focus as intently as you can for those 25 minutes. Now, if you're like me, here's what I'll do. I find that I'm kind of messing around on the web, just reading random stuff. And who knew that moths can actually deflect, bat stuff or whatever. So, and then I realized, wait a minute, now I'm supposed to be working on this book chapter. And so I said, great, I'll set a Pomodoro. And so I set a timer for 25 minutes, and then I start working. And I work really super hard, and sweat is pouring from my brow. I'm really kind of pleased with myself. And I look up at the timer, and I've just done 2 minutes of the Pomodoro. And my brain screams, I can't do 23 more minutes of the Pomodoro. And I do the Zen thing. I just let that thought go right on by, and I return my focus to whatever I'm working on. And the reality is pretty much anybody can do 25 minutes. So, but then comes the most important part of all, and that is to reward yourself. Now, we've always thought before that the only time you're actually learning something is when you're focusing. But no, that's only part of when the learning process occurs. Another part occurs when you're relaxing, when you're not focusing. In fact, that's when your brain is consolidating this information. So giving yourself a little reward, a 5 to 10 minute break where you just get your mind off it, do anything else that's kind of relaxing. If you're writing a report, don't go on Facebook and continue writing. You don't want to use that same part of the brain. But anything else, you can go on a video game, get up, sweep your floor, or go to the kitchen, get some tea, dance to your favorite music, whatever floats your boat that's different than what you were working on. And this is a really powerful way for building your focus and your concentration, but also allowing you to gain those benefits of relaxing for a bit and allowing your brain to work in the background. So the Pomodoro is truly an effective technique. One piece of advice I could give you is don't sit there and think, I'm going to grade all these homeworks, or I'm going to finish this entire homework set in this 25 minutes. You don't want to think that way. You want to think just in terms of, I have to work as effectively as I can for 25 minutes. Now, if I really get into the groove, interestingly, neuroscience has shown that after about 20 minutes, that initial pain in the brain will die away. So sometimes you'll find yourself getting into the flow of something that you really didn't want to get into. And if that's the case, I allow myself to keep going. So I can work, 25, an hour, 2 hours or more. But whenever I'm done, I take a nice little diffuse mode break. And what this is doing is it's wiring your brain to enjoy that process of focusing even more, because it's kind of like Pavlov's dogs. I mean, Pavlov, he trained the dogs so that he would ring a bell, and a little while later, he would give them a reward, give them some food. So in the meantime, the dogs quickly learned that they were going to get food. And in the meantime, they'd get so happy. They'd be just, because they knew they were going to get something. And it's a little like that for your brain. You know you're going to get a reward, and you begin to enjoy that in-between process. Also, especially in this day and age, social media is designed deliberately to be addictive. So you want to compulsively check what's going on. And kids are almost trained to check what's going on their phone, see if they have any messages. So training them or introducing them to this technique is also introducing them to a way of practicing focus and paying attention for a while. And that can allow them to get more deeply into a material. There's a great book out called The Shallows, just talking about how the differences between today's sort of generation and even older people like myself. It's harder to get in deeply into a book, for example, just because we're so used to kind of going out and shallowly surfing the web and so forth. So this technique is a really good way of intervening and getting your mind reset so you can also dive deep in your concentration. Now, speaking of diving deep, there's something we should do, and that is to look more deeply in what our brain is doing. And to do that, we need to look at the fundamental building block of the brain, and that is the neuron. So, it's so funny. If you could see the faces, you can see everybody here kind of going, and this is where she gets to the super boring part of the... So let's spice things up a little bit. And so this is our analogy for a neuron, and it is a space alien. So neurons, we know, have the nucleus. So there's the nucleus, that's the eye of our space alien. And our space alien has this hand reaching out of its head. I mean, it's a space alien. And so that is called, in neuron speak, an axon. And then the space alien has a bunch of legs, and those are called dendrites. And there's lots of toes on our space alien, and those are called, in reality, dendritic spines. So what neurons do, in essence, is their arm will reach out, and it wants to touch the toe of a subsequent neuron. So it's kind of doing this sort of thing. Let's see here. We've got, okay, come on. There we go. Okay. So we have so that's what neurons do. They reach out and they touch one another and they make connections and send signals. So here we go. Here's this is what it is in real life. We've got a signal traveling along, and it goes across that synaptic gap and onto the next neuron. So it actually is a little bit more complicated than that. We've got the electrical signal comes down, and then we've got neurotransmitters going across and so forth, and then it continues on as electrical signal, but because I'm an electrical engineer, I will just call this an electrical signal that's propagating along, and that's close enough. So when you learn something, what's happening is you're creating a set of links. So here you can see that we've got a connection between 5 neurons. And this is kind of symbolically representing something like you're learning how to play a chord on the guitar, or you're learning how to conjugate a verb in Spanish, for example. Or you might be learning how to take a derivative, how to do a certain piece of an algorithm, or even a dance step. So what you're doing, anytime you are learning something, you are making changes in your long-term memory. You are creating sets of links. And so what's happening when you practice something is you are building those sets of links. So you're kind of making those connections stronger. So you can kind of think of it as you've got this set of links you've built because you've learned something, and the more you practice, sort of the thicker and richer those sets of links become. So what happens though? Let's say that one of your students comes to class, they learn the material, they understood it when you said it in class. And then they get really busy in their everyday life, and they go off, and 2 weeks later you have a test. So they look it back over the night before, and suddenly what made sense in class makes no sense at all. And this is because they haven't practiced and used those little neural links, and their synaptic sort of janitors sweep away those unused links, and it results in you don't understand the material even if you understood it before. Once I had a student come up to me and say, he'd flunked a test. He shows it to me as all red line. He says, I cannot understand how I could have flunked this test. I understood it when you said it in class. So this is why it's so important for us to emphasize as teachers, understanding is really good. It's incredibly valuable, but unless you practice and build those neural links, it can just sweep right away. So what happens, and I find this fascinating, is when you are learning something during the day, you've got your, that little dendrite there, and when you're really focusing hard, you are actually causing a little dendritic spine to kind of start budding out. Why isn't it all the way out with a nice connection? It's because you started out, but then what really happens is, oh, we want to turn the, oh, you'll remember this, won't you? So what really happens is when you're going to sleep at night, that's when that practice, when your dendritic spine really pops out and makes those solid connections. So it's learning during the day is invaluable. It gets things started if you're actively trying to learn it, but it's when you go to sleep at night, that's when it really begins to start building that neural structure. And that's why it's so important for, well, I should say, here is a wonderful light microscopy image that shows a neuron before learning and before sleep. And here's the same neuron, same living neuron, after learning and after sleep. And if you'll notice here, wherever you have these blue triangles, that's showing a new dendritic spine that has emerged at night while you were sleeping and making that new neural connection. So we can actually see this happening. It's really an incredible process. And this is why it's so valuable to practice day by day. You're creating these nice sets of links, and each night when you go to sleep, you're building those links. So you want to practice during the day, or practice day by day. They found that 10 hours of studying in one day is nowhere near, so if you're cramming everything in one day, it is nowhere near as effective as spacing out your learning. Why? Because you don't have as much time to make those neural connections, and it's a lot easier for your little metabolic vampires to, or janitors, to sweep those processes away. If you learn over a number of days, each night when you sleep, you're building, you're really consolidating those sets of connections, and it makes a much stronger basis. Sometimes really, really smart students can do fine in high school, and then they cram because they're really smart. So they just cram, and then they get to college, and they cram, and they find about the middle of the semester of a more difficult subject, they're beginning to struggle because they're just not used to this idea of how do I, of having to create sets of neural structures. And so you can find sometimes really, really smart students that are struggling because they don't know how their brain is working. You can have a nice metaphor for this kind of thing. A good one I like to use is just building a brick wall. If you build a brick wall, you let the mortar dry. You take the time between the layers, and ultimately you'll have a very solid structure. But if you don't do that, you'll have a structure that's kind of not a very solid foundation for learning in any case. So learning is a lot like baking. I think one thing that we can remember is that learning is almost like weightlifting. We can look at this fellow and we know that he was not creating that set of muscles by cramming the night before. But because we can't see that something similar is taking place in building neural structure as is taking place with muscular structure, we often just think, oh yeah, we can do it last minute. And it's actually not a really effective way of learning. So speaking about athletes, I have to bring you to one of my favorite athletes of all time. And this is a fellow named Julius Jaego. And Julius, I think, exemplifies some very important ideas related to learning and what we know about learning nowadays. So Julius, he was from Kenya, and he, if you know anything about Kenya, it is very famous for its long-distance runners. Well, Julius, ever since he was a child, wanted to grow up and become a world champion javelin thrower. Well, there's no javelin throwing coaches in Kenya. Nobody was ever really interested in that there. And so what Julius did was he started watching YouTube videos. And he would watch those videos, and then he'd go out and he'd actively practice. Then he'd sleep at night. And then he'd go the next day and do it over and over again. And do you know that by watching YouTube videos, a tiny bit of coaching at the end, he won the world champion in javelin. So it's really an extraordinary story. But it also shows that, well, some online materials and direct instruction, coupled with active involvement by the student, can really take you to some astonishing places. But I like Julius's story because he also shows something else that we've recently discovered about learning. We know that for some weird reason, exercise really helps improve your ability to learn and remember. And we've known this for a number of years, but we have not known why. Well, very, very recently, they found that when you exercise, as Julius was doing, you produce a substance in your brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's abbreviated as BDNF. So why would that help with learning? Well, if you look, here is a neuron, living neuron again. Before application, some BDNF was essentially sprinkled on this neuron. And this is what happened to the neuron after they applied BDNF. Look at all those dendritic spines just automatically kind of popping up. Can you see? That would make learning so much easier if you have, these dendritic spines kind of already available. So that is part of why exercise can be such a valuable enhancement to any learning program. So this brings me to, I think, one of the most important parts of this entire talk. And this relates to how do we really master new information? And we have to master new information. It's helpful for us if we know the difference between working memory and long-term memory. So working memory is it's what we can hold temporarily in mind. So you get a Google code, and you have 47325, and you got to hold it in mind while you type it somewhere else. So that's just your short-term memory. Long-term memory, on the other hand, are things you really, you have kind of embedded in. So the name of your friends, your own name, the facial features of people you know, and so forth. How to get to your home. All these kinds of ideas are in your long-term memory. So your working memory, where is that in your brain? It is in your prefrontal cortex, kind of towards the front. And I like to think of it as almost like an octopus, an intentional octopus, and it can hold 4 different things. Psychologists say you've got 4 slots of working memory. They used to think it was 7. Now they think it's 4. If I haven't had my coffee yet, it's like 1. But anyway, so you've got this working memory. It's like an attentional octopus. It's got 4 arms, in the front of your brain. So where's long-term memory? It is all over your brain. But for our purposes, let's just kind of put it all in one place, and we'll call it a locker. So here we go. We've got our locker. And what's inside the locker? It is all those long-term, or all those sets of links that you've created because you practiced and learned something and put it in long-term memory. So when you're learning something new, your working memory is often working really, really hard to master that material. And so it's working hard, but then when it's mastered the material, you've understood it, you practiced with it, it's almost like you've created this nice set of links. And then all you need to do when you want to work with that material, it's like this subroutine that you've got parked out over there, and your little attentional octopus can just think about it and then reach out and grab that set of links and pull it to mind. So this brings me to our daughter, Rachel. So our younger daughter, Rachel. So when my husband and I were doing the filming for Learning How to Learn, the massive open online course, my daughters got used to me asking a lot of strange questions. So one evening for dinner, I said, I need someone to model what it's like, well, basically to model backing up a car really badly. And my younger daughter was like, Mom, I've got this. I can do this. So here's our younger daughter. And so Rachel is, this is pretty much what she was like not long before when she had learned to back up the car. And notice her little face. She's like trying to, now which mirror does she look in? Does she look in the front mirror? Does she look in the side mirror? Or which side? Or wait, does she look behind it? And then off she goes into the ditch. But what was really happening here? If you look, she was trying to figure out what was going on, and her little attentional octopus, as she was first learning, was going crazy while she was first trying to figure things out. But once she figured out how to back up, so she had a heavy cognitive load at that time, and none of her little attentional octopus arms were available because they were all working trying to make those sets of links. But once she figured out how to back up the car, suddenly she had that set of links. All she needs to do when she wants to back up the car is think, oh, back up the car. And then her attentional octopus can grab that set of links, and notice she has a light cognitive load and she has lots of working memory available. In other words, her other arms of this attentional octopus they're free. So she can think about things like, where is, do I have my seatbelt fastened? Oh, let's listen to a little bit of music and so forth. So learning is a lot like this. Whatever you're learning, you want to create nice sets of links so your working memory is not overloaded with things. Instead, what can happen is, let's say you're going to take a test in something and you know it pretty well. Well, you park yourself in front of the test. You think, oh, wait, I'll take that set of links and I connect it with this other set of links and one more. And it's easy to do. You're not trying to like figure everything out at once where your working memory is going crazy. Sometimes today, there are students who have real severe test anxiety, but there are also students, and these students have studied very, very hard. But a significant percentage of students, they will sit down to take a test, and if they haven't created those sets of links, they can think, oh, I looked at the book, I understood it when I was looking at the book. They didn't realize they weren't practicing with it and they hadn't created those sets of neural links. And so they look at the test, they're completely lost, and they think it's test anxiety, when it's actually they haven't created those sets of links. And so this is why I think it's so important to help students understand how truly effective learning takes place, so they don't confuse their study habits with the challenges they may experience when they're taking tests. So as it turns out, when you are learning anything, if you become an expert in whatever you're learning, experts are the commonality they have, no matter what they're an expert in, whether it's race car driving or advanced mathematics or dance or whatever, they have lots and lots of sets of neural links that they've created by virtue of the fact that they practiced really well with the material. So this brings me to something that's called illusions of competence in learning. Now, have you ever done this thing? I do this fairly often. I'll read a page, and then I get to the end of the page and I go, what did I just read? And this is a pretty common thing to do. So a good way to check whether you're fooling yourself is using a method called recall. And with this, what you do is you will look at a page, and then what you want to do is look away and see if you can recall the key information that's on that page. And by doing this, you actually understand that material more deeply. It's not just remembering, it's not just memorizing. In fact, studies have shown you really understand it better. So recall is incredibly effective as a method to check and see whether you're fooling yourself. Now, the other method that is really useful, test yourself every chance you can get. So if you're really trying to learn something, the more you can test yourself, the more you can actively check whether you've learned the material. So sometimes there's a little, like we know when you're studying medicine, for example, there is so much you have to memorize. And so there's, anatomical terms, people will make flashcards. But for some reason, there is this antagonism nowadays. I think for thousands of years, actually, the only way people thought that you actually learned something was to memorize it. Well, that's not the only way you learn something. And so starting about the 1950s, there began to be a movement where understanding was more important than memorization. And so what we did was we kind of went, okay, memorization, no, now understanding. But actually we threw a little bit of the baby out with the bathwater when we did that, because a little bit of memorization helps you build that neural foundation. You have to have long-term changes in your brain in order to learn something. And sometimes a little memorization can help. So, doctors know this, that's why they have to memorize a lot of terms and so forth. Poets will often say, memorize the poem and you will understand it more deeply. But as an engineer, I say, why should we let the poets have all the fun? So, I mean, a little memorization, judicious memorization of key equations and so forth can actually be helpful in learning in math and science as well. So test yourself, use flashcards, any other mechanism. A very good way of learning is just look at problems, do practice problems, and then once you know you can do it, see if you can step through those problems just in your mind. Why should we do, I mean, you would never as a musician just sing a song once and say, yeah, I got it. But students all the time, they will do a homework problem, turn it in, and that's the last they ever do it. But actually, some of these key problems, if they internalize them the way they do a song, it can really be helpful for them. So sometimes I think a challenge for people is that some of our very, very best attributes are often thought of as very bad attributes. So what do I mean by that? For example, let's say you have a poor memory. Well, we often think that's a bad thing, but I am here to tell you that having a poor memory is actually a good thing. And the reason for that is this. Well, remember how I talked about your attentional octopus with those four arms? And some people have super sticky attentional octopuses. The tentacles can reach out and they can grab and they hold on to this stuff and they just really have things. And other people are more like, okay, they got it, they go, ooh, shiny. And they get distracted and something falls out. But when something falls out, something else comes in. And that's why these individuals can often be, as research has shown, very creative. So if you are one of those individuals that struggles a little bit, your working memory can't hold things and put things very easily into long-term memory, well, that does mean that you have to work a little harder to keep up with the intellectual Joneses, so to speak. But you would not want to trade that extra creativity that this can often manifest. So it can be a very good thing. Now, another challenge that people experience is slow thinking or slow learning. I will teach a class sometimes and I'll ask a very difficult question and you can see the class is just going, I have no idea, but there'll be some person in the front row got their hand up, just really fast. And you can see everybody else going, what's in it for me? I mean, they're never going to be as fast a learner or a fast a thinker as that one person who's the fast question answerer. But it is true. Some people have race car-like brains. So they can get to the finish line really fast. And other people have what I think of more as hiker-type brains. So they get to the finish line, but it's a lot more slowly. But think about what the hiker experiences. I mean, the hiker can reach out, they can touch the leaves on the trees, they can smell the pine in the air, see the little rabbit trails, hear the birds. Completely different experience, and in some ways, much richer and deeper. Now, my hero in science is a man named Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And Cajal was a terrible student. He had an awful working memory, so he couldn't learn very easily, was, shall we say, attentionally disordered, and so he was also kicked out of a number of elementary schools as he was growing up. His father just gave up on him, and it's strange to say he won the Nobel Prize and is now considered the father of modern neuroscience. So Cajal was once asked, what was your secret? How did you do this? And he said, well, for one thing, I was persistent. So I I really worked away at things and I didn't give up. But he said the other thing was I was flexible. He said, I worked. I'm no genius. And he wasn't. He really struggled to learn. But he said, I have worked with many geniuses. And the thing with geniuses is they're super smart. So they figure things out really quickly. But they get used to doing everything really quickly. And so sometimes they don't get enough information. They'll make a decision about something, jump to conclusions, and then when they're wrong, they're not used to being wrong. So they intellectually simply use their intellect to justify why they must have been right after all, instead of saying, well, now wait a minute, maybe I was wrong and I need to readjust. So if you're one of those, if you're not a genius, just keep in mind, sometimes you can do things that even geniuses cannot. So with that, I would like to thank you so much for your attention today. It's been a real privilege to share.